Whether you've just started teaching or spent decades in the classroom, you know there's always more to learn. But where do you start? Well, here at Hillsdale College, we have the answer for you. Tried and True, a primer on sound pedagogy by Hillsdale College professor Daniel Coupland. In this little book, you'll read lessons from more than 25 years of Dr. Coupland's classroom experience. It's all distilled into 14 easy-to-read chapters on lesson planning, assignments, and classroom management, and it will help you improve your skills and inspire you as a teacher, one of our most important professions. Whether you've been in front of the classroom for years, or this is your first year, when you read Tried and True, you'll find something to help you keep improving every single day. You don't need to go at it alone. Let Dr. Coupland's real-world experience encourage you and inspire you. You can get your copy today at hillsdale.edu/true. That's hillsdale.edu/TRUE. Thanks for listening.
Welcome to the Hillsdale College K-12 Classical Education Podcast, bringing you insight into classical education and its unique emphasis on human virtue and moral character, responsible citizenship, content-rich curricula, and teacher-led classrooms. Now your host, Scot Bertram.
Thanks for listening. The Hillsdale College K-12 Classical Education Podcast is part of the Hillsdale College Podcast Network. More episodes at podcast.hillsdale.edu or wherever you find your audio. You also can find more information on topics and ideas discussed on this show at our website, k12.hillsdale.edu. We continue our series of episodes from presentations delivered at the Hoogland Center for Teacher Excellence Seminar on the Art of Teaching Children's Literature. The Hoogland Center for Teacher Excellence is an outreach of the Hillsdale College K-12 Education Office. It offers seminars in classical academics and pedagogy for teachers nationwide of any background. Seminars are led by the faculty, leadership, and master teachers of Hillsdale College. There is no cost to attend, and attendees may earn professional development credits. Currently, the Hoogland Center is hosting a series of events on the art of teaching. On February 29th and March 1st of 2024 in Grand Rapids, Michigan, it's the Art of Teaching the Sciences. And April 11th and 12th in Ann Arbor, it's the Art of Teaching American History. To learn more and register, please visit the webpage for the Hoogland Center for Teacher Excellence at k12.hillsdale.edu. Check the Events tab and look for Hoogland Center. Or write to cte@hillsdale.edu. In September 2023, Dr. Dan Coupland, Dean of the Diana Davis Spencer Graduate School of Classical Education and Professor of Education at Hillsdale College, spoke on the formative power of children's literature. In this portion of his lecture, he provides an example of formative images in children's literature, sharing a summary of the stories of friendship in The Wind and the Willows.
Let's do an example, and I'm going to pull from, I'm kind of cheating because I'm pulling from one of my favorite stories here. So let me tell you a little bit about The Wind and the Willows. Wind and the Willows was written by Kenneth Grahame, and he was actually a banker at the Bank of England in London, and he and his wife Elspeth had one child named Alistair, and Alistair was not an easy child, and so to calm him down in the evening, Kenneth would actually tell him stories about these characters. So let me just see. Oh yeah, here's a photograph of Alistair. Now, if I had time, I would read you praise from Teddy Roosevelt. He absolutely adored this book and wrote a letter to Kenneth Grahame and said, I have read it and read it again, and I now see them as true friends, right? He loved this story. I can't resist, so I'm going to read A.A. Milne's praise of it. This was in the 1933 edition. A.A. Milne, who's the author of Winnie the Pooh, House of Pooh Corner, and some great children's poetry, this is what he said in the introduction. He said, one can argue with the merits of most books, and in arguing understand the point of view of one's opponent. One may seem even to come to the conclusion, possibly, that he is right after all. One does not argue with the wind in the willows. He says this, the young man gives it to the girl with whom he is in love, and if she does not like it, asks her to return his letters. The old man tries it on his nephew and alters his will accordingly. The book is a test of character. We cannot criticize it because it is criticizing us. It is a household book, a book in which everyone in the household loves and quotes continually. A book which is, get this, I could just see A.A. Milne greeting people at the door of his home, reading passages. Just listen to this. A book which is read aloud to every new guest and is regarded as the touchstone of his worth. In other words, if you don't like this story, you can leave. But I must give you one word of warning. When you sit down to it, don't be so ridiculous as to suppose that you are sitting in judgment of my taste or the art of Kenneth Grahame. You are merely sitting in judgment of yourself. You may be worthy, I do not know, but it is you who is on trial. That's pretty high praise. So that's A.A. Milne. All right, I'm going to read you two passages from The Wind in the Willows. And before I do, let me introduce the characters. Oh, by the way, these illustrations are actually done by Robert Ingpen, who illustrated a beautiful edition. E.H. Shepard also illustrated it, and his images are probably the classic versions. But let me just introduce you to the characters here. Let me start with Toad. Here's my description of Toad. Toad is wild, impulsive, proud, insensitive, and unstable. I don't have time to go into it, but my college roommate my junior year was Toad. So this comes from chapter 2. This is what it says. Notice, if you were in here to hear Ben Whalen talk about poetry, he encouraged you to pay attention to the language, how the language is communicating as well. Listen to this. This is from chapter 2. Now, Kenneth Grahame can be very lengthy in his sentences, but when he's describing Toad, the language actually describes Toad as well. Listen to this. The open road, the dusty highway, the heath, the common, the hedgerows, the rolling downs, camps, villages, towns, cities, exclamation point. Right? There's not even verbs in this. It's just a list of nouns. He doesn't have time for verbs, let alone adjectives. Here we go. Here today, up and off somewhere else tomorrow. Travel, change, interest, excitement, the world before you, and a horizon that's always changing. That's Toad. That's the way he lives his life, this frenetic life. All right. Now, with Badger, I refer to him as Mr. Badger out of respect. As I've grown older, I've grown in my respect of him. He's older, he's wiser, he's actually somewhat asocial. He doesn't like, nor does he seek attention. He is quietly compassionate and even gentle. If you know this book well, the chapter called Mr. Badger, he seems very gruff, but when the hedgehogs show up, he's this kind of old, kind uncle that takes care of them. But if you've also read the story, you know that in chapter 12, he can be incredibly fierce. In fact, when they go back to Toad Hall and they come up through the cellar and the weasels are out in the dining room, there's this moment where he grabs his club and he takes the other members and he puts them behind him and he uses 2 words. He says, "Follow me." And the next word is when they enter into the dining room, there's 1-word sentence, "my." That's it. So when he has to be, he can be incredibly fierce. This is what C.S. Lewis said about Mr. Badger. He says this, "Consider Mr. Badger in The Wind in the Willows, that extraordinary amalgam of high rank, coarse manners, gruffness, shyness, and goodness." Then he says this, "The child who has once met Mr. Badger has ever after in his bones a knowledge of humanity and English social history, which he could not get any other way." That's Lewis praising Mr. Badger. That's how high he thought. Then there's Rat. Rat is the kind mentor. He's the teacher. He's the guide. He's very domestic. He loves preparation and organization when they're going to attack Toad Hall. He's A sword for you, a sword for you, a sword for you, a gun for you, a gun for you. When he goes to rescue Mole, I love this image. He straps on his belt, puts a pistol in, puts a club in, and grabs a cudgel. Isn't it great to have a conversation about what a cudgel is? He knows the river and loves everything about it. And this is when in chapter 1, when he's playing the role of mentor and he's introducing Mole to the riverbank, and Mole makes a mistake. It goes like this. When Mole casually refers to, in his first boat ride on the river, he says, "So, this is a river." Rat immediately jumps in and he says, "The river." Right? This is not just any old flowing, this is the river. So he is Mr. Riverbank. He gossips with Otter all the time. You know all this. Okay. Last but not least is Mole. He's the newcomer. He's the novice. He's childlike. He's curious, eager, honest about his inexperience and wants to learn. Let me give you a window. If you ever teach Wind in the Willows, he is us. We're new to the riverbank as well. And we get to see the riverbank through his eyes. Mole is playing a very similar role that Jim Hawkins is playing in Treasure Island. Jim Hawkins is a little bit of a flat character because all the characters around him are just so extravagant. But we get to see these characters through Jim's eyes. Same thing in Wind in the Willows. Mole is our way of viewing the riverbank. So there are lots of themes, as with any complex piece of literature, there's lots of themes going on. But I would argue one of the most important themes is the idea of friendship. In fact, I posed as a question. It's a question that I pose to my students. You heard Dr. Greg talk last night about coming up with a great opening question. This is my question to the Wind in the Willows. What does it mean to be a friend? And Kenneth Grahame gives us images of how to actually answer that. I'm only going to read you one scene, and it's a relationship. It's the relationship between Rat and Mole. Oh, by the way, in Attending the Heart of Virtue, Vigan Garoyan spends an entire chapter on the Wind in the Willows, and it's really good. I'm not going to read you the example from chapter 1 along the riverbank because it's a little bit long. But I will tell you this. I'm happy to engage in an argument that this chapter contains one of the best apologies in all of English literature, where what we would say Mole gets out over his skis, as oftentimes young people do. In fact, it talks about he gets big with pride and he makes a fool of himself. And he has to actually appeal to Rat to apologize for him. So I'll actually just read the apology. It's beautiful because Grahame is pointing both to the external, how he looks, but also to the internal. This external is going on. Listen to this. When all was ready to start once more, the Mole, limp and dejected, that's showing him on the outside, took his seat in the stern of the boat, and they set off. He said in a low voice, broken with emotion, and here it is. You can actually break it down into 4 parts. You might not want to do this with students, going about analyzing it too much, but just listen to this. He says this, Ratty, my generous friend, notice he identifies the relationship. I'm very sorry indeed for my foolish and ungrateful conduct. My heart quite fails me when I think of how I might have lost the beautiful luncheon basket. The luncheon basket's Rat's, by the way. He could have said your luncheon basket. In other words, he identifies how his behavior impacted his friend. All right, he says this, indeed, I have been a complete ass. Now, we need to talk about whether you would use ass with your class, but I have been a complete ass, and I know it. Notice how he's taking ownership of the behavior. And then last part of the apology is an appeal. Will you overlook it at once and forgive me and let things go on as before? Notice it's an appeal to the friend. Will you restore the relationship by accepting my apology? Because I want things to go back to the way they were. At that point, Mole has nothing more to say, and nor does he say anything, because he's in a position now where Rat needs to answer. Rat's response is beautiful. That's all right. Bless you, he says. And then he says, what's a little wet to a water rat? I'm more in the water than out of it most days. Don't you think any more about it? Look here. And then he points him in a completely different direction. That is a beautiful image of what a good apology is and how to respond to an apology as well. All right. I'm going to steal as much time as I need because I want to read you this. It's a much shorter. Let me lay out the context for you. In chapter 2, and then I'll conclude with this. In chapter 2, Mole is longing to meet Toad. And he's asking and asking, can we go meet Toad? Can we go? Rat finally gives in. He also wants to meet the Badger, but they also realize you only go to Badger when the time is right. So they go to Toad, and you can actually see, let me see if this works. You can see Toad right up here. This is Toad in his gypsy wagon. And he says, let's go. I've got the newest thing. I've got this gypsy wagon. We're going on an adventure. There's no conversation. We're ready to go. Rat's like, I've done this before. No, thank you very much. Mole, the neophyte, is saying, you better believe we're going. So Rat actually says, okay, fine. He doesn't say this, but it's kind of like, for your sake, I'll go on this journey. So they go off with Toad on this journey in the gypsy wagon. And we pick up the story at the end of the first day. And here's the image. It's short, but notice, remember the fundamental question, what does it mean to be a friend? Even to a friend like someone like Toad. It says this, late in the evening, tired and happy and miles from home, they drew up on a remote common far from habitations, turned the horse loose to graze, ate their simple supper sitting on the grass, by the side of the cart. Get this line. Toad talked big about all he was going to do in the days to come. That's typical Toad, right? We're going to do this. It's going to be grand, kind of a thing, right? While the stars grew fuller and larger around them, and the yellow moon appearing suddenly and silently from nowhere in particular, came to keep them company and listen to their talk. So the moon is getting bigger, almost peering in, because the moon too wants to hear what they have to say. At last they turned into their little bunks in the cart, and Toad, kicking out his legs, sheepishly said, well, good night, you fellows. This is the life of a real gentleman. And then this is his last words. Talk about your old river. Now, you have to know the characters, and I already told you, Rat is Mr. River. It's all about the river. This is an insult to Rat. He's kind of like saying, oh, you think the river is great. Isn't this grand? Look at the cart. Look at the adventures we're having. Go ahead. I'm going to bed. Talk about your old river. How do we know it's an insult? Well, look at the response. Now, remember, Rat, Mr. River, right, has Mole right there, who he's trying to bring to become a riverbanker. And this is what he says. And it's actually in the text. It's very big. The word don't is in all caps. I don't talk about my river, replied patient Rat. You know I don't, Toad. Now, notice in the text prior, it said, Toad talked big about all he was going to do. In other words, the big talker is Toad, not Rat, right? Says, I don't talk about my river, replied the Rat. You know I don't, Toad. And then he says, but I think about it. And he added pathetically in a lower tone, I think about it all the time. He's wounded. The insult on Rat worked. So he's like, okay, yes, I do. I'm not going to turn my back on my river. Then get this. The Mole reached out from under his blanket and felt for the Rat's paw in the darkness and gave it a squeeze. I'll do whatever you like, Ratty, he whispered. Shall we run away tomorrow morning? Quite early, very early, and go back to our old dear hole on the river? Now that's an appeal that Mole has made to Rat. Now Rat has a decision to make. Now remember, Rat plays a wide variety of roles in this, right? Number one, he is the teacher and the mentor to Mole, but he is also a friend to Toad. So his decision has to be more than just in the immediate. Get Rat's reply. Remember, he's wounded, he's hurt. No, we'll stick it out, whispered back the Rat. Thanks awfully. In other words, he realizes that Mole is trying to do something kind. But Rat needs to rise above that moment. He needs to rise above his hurt feelings. But I ought to stick by Toad till this trip ended. It wouldn't be safe for him to be left for himself. Isn't that great? He's thinking of Toad. It won't take long. His fads never do. So there's a little bit of a jab back, which is nice. I like to say that. You're right. And then he says, good night. Isn't that a beautiful image? In fact, if you fast forward in the story, you see this episode being played out throughout the book, where Mole is actually learning what it means to be a good friend, not just by rules, but by example. He's watching how Rat handles his friend. So how does he become a good friend? By observing Rat. And all of those images are in his own moral imagination. Those are just two images that I gave you from one story that are incredibly powerful in shaping much more than be a good friend, be kind. We need that, but we also need the images as well.
That was Dr. Dan Coupland, Dean of the Diana Davis Spencer Graduate School of Classical Education and Professor of Education at Hillsdale College, at a portion of his lecture, The Formative Power of Children's Literature. Remember, you can learn from Dr. Coupland and many other Hillsdale College professors at online.hillsdale.edu through Hillsdale's online courses. One of more than 30 courses available is Dr. Coupland's Classic Children's Literature. Look for it at online.hillsdale.edu. To learn more and register for the Hoogland Center for Teacher Excellence, go to k12.hillsdale.edu, click the Events tab, and look for Hoogland Center, or write to cte@hillsdale.edu. I'm Scot Bertram. We invite you to like us on Facebook. Search for Hillsdale College K-12 Classical Education. You also can follow us on Instagram at Hillsdale_K12. Hillsdale_K12 on Instagram. Thank you for listening to the Hillsdale College K-12 Classical Education Podcast, part of the Hillsdale College Podcast Network. More episodes at podcast.hillsdale.edu or wherever you find your audio.